moved from what Dr. Chaudhary called giving voice to the voiceless. How does a museum actually represent those who often go unrepresented? That question is almost something that hangs in the air within museums. To the way in which, for instance, Rahul spoke about what is invisible to us when we enter a museum, the amount of work that gets made in thinking about the design and the interface between what you call front of house and what you call back of house. How there are two hearts to a museum. One is what you see, and one is what you don't see, which is the storage area. And the design of museums to take into account how a museum will grow, because its growth depends on its ability to actually store. And it was very interesting to think about, for instance, where he mentioned that storage and display itself may intersect and overlap between spaces. To the way in which Martin talked about unexpected discoveries of producing archival datum of which the usage and the recall, you do not know at the time that you make it. So every time a curator or an archive or a museum director includes something in the collection, they're not necessarily having to always answer to themselves what use this will be. In some ways, very tangentially, it leads me to the question that was raised by the young interlocutor about sustainability. No one has ever asked a famous diamond merchant about the sustainability of his business plans. The question about sustainability always gets asked in arts institutions, and I find this completely pointless. Because we are living in a situation where the government spends a minuscule fraction of the budget on culture, which most institutions feel compelled to return, because it is better to not spend money in the government of India than to spend money, right? So you're talking about sustainability of institutions that are by default designed to actually underperform. So there's a question that we as citizens have to ask is, how do we repeatedly elect governments that put their worst performing members as culture ministers? Right? I mean, how is this possible? Right? Okay. Let's move back again from sustainability to the question that Janvi raised, that a museum is actually a working proposition. It's not necessarily only a collecting institution, and it is not necessarily only a pedagogical instrument designed to deliver easy lessons. There is actually a very good, that kind of science museum in Bangalore, the Vishveshwaraya Museum of Science and Technology, where you can push a lot of buttons. Not all of them work, but if you push, I mean, I've pushed a lot of buttons in that museum. Things do light up and you finally understand what gravity is. But I think the kind of space that Jahnavi is actually contemplating is not something in which you go away, buy a ticket and produce some kind of consumed knowledge for yourself, but is actually a place where you rethink everything. So it's a place where I imagine the 15 to 25-year-old should be challenged as much as the working scientist in the Indian Institute of Science, right? Or the artist who is keen to actually explore what being in conversation with science is about. And finally, to come to the conflictorium, which I think that one of the things that Avani said that will stay with me is this question of adjudicating the importance of events and time. That these are not necessarily fixed and decided questions. It would be a great injustice to the victims of the violence of 2002 if we were to privilege 2002 over everything else. There is a slide that she showed that I would like to urge your attention towards. It was when you were talking about the students, I think. There's an accompanying slide of a staircase. And on the wall, there was an inscription in Arabic. Now, not everybody recognizes that inscription, but it says a very simple thing. كل يوم كربلاء كل يوم عاشوراء كل أرض كربلاء, which means every day is Ashura, the day of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, and every day is Ashura and every place is Karbala, which indicates that there is a different, perhaps, register of time that museums open us out to. They open us out to thinking about time in a fundamentally more interesting way than in terms of simple chronology or of great catastrophes in ordinary events. They ask us to rethink time in a fundamental way so that we are able to see everyday life in terms of its triumphs and its tragedies, and every place in terms of its magnificence as well as its ordinariness, which is sort of the Kulle Yome, Ashura, Kulle Arze, Karbala aphorism, which leads me to think that that's a nice intersection for me to go to my actual concluding remarks. Now, I, being a good student of Arundhati Ghosh, had a proper presentation prepared, but which I will truncate in the interests of time. And as my other great teacher, the singer Bob Dylan, once said, inside the museum, infinity goes up on trial. This is what salvation looks like after a while. So every museum is a place for the adjudication of disputes in relation to eternity and infinity, Ashura and Karbala. The remarks that I'm going to make come by way of a parallel and invisible process to most, which Naman has been a part of, which Romila Thapar has been a part of, at the Goethe-Institut, where we have been discussing periodically in closed-door conversations the future of the museum as an idea. And so, with the permission of our host Farah Batul, I will simply transfer some of the thinking that I have had the fortune to do in that context into this one. And today being, it's good, I mean, I'm always thinking about calendars and clocks, so forgive me, but today is the 8th of March, which is International Women's Day. And this lovely picture is the future meeting the past of the human species, because that object in the vitrine is the lady that is known as Dinkinesh in the Afar language, or Lucy in English, who is designated as the first human being, who happens to be a woman. So it might be an interesting way to think about that where we meet the first woman and the first human being today, in this time, is actually in a museum. It's where the future goes to keep its date with other times. Which, I mean, I've seen this scene repeated in museums all over the world. This is the same scene. It's a family in Patna keeping appointment with Didarganj Yakshi, right? And finding themselves in each of these encounters are about people finding some connection between themselves, their tomorrow, and the remote antiquity of the human condition. In fact, the remote antiquity of the earth itself. I had lots of slides to show you, which I'm not going to show you, about one of my other favorite museums, which is the Indian Museum in Calcutta, where there's an entire gallery which just says, the beginning of life. And of course, that's where it begins. But it's a question of, what happens when we go into a museum? What happens when we enter a museum, and what happens when we exit a museum? Every middle-class family actually keeps a little, what is called a showcase. And I can show you a little slide of what I mean by that showcase. It has usually a few objects of importance, right? A seashell, the Taj Mahal, the picture of Priyanka Chopra, Sai Baba, a couple from a doll collection, and so on. This is, everybody has a museum, right? And it is these museological acts on a daily basis that also ask us to think about the relationships between the collection of objects, the interpretation of times, and the presence of ourselves in relation to these objects. Let me come back to where I was going to. So, that's a classic icon. Everybody recognizes this. It's a Nataraja, it's a Chola Nataraja. But And you can take this for granted. You go into the National Museum, you can see these things, they're well lit, you see them, and you come out. But remember always that it was once impossible for many people to set eyes upon the Nataraja, right? We know, for instance, that the early medieval Tamil Shaivite devotional poet Nandanar was forbidden to even glimpse the icon of Shiva, the god he was devoted to, because he belonged to an untouchable caste. When Nandanar mustered the courage to enter the sanctum of the famous Shuddhabrata temple in Madurai, the mere fact of having gazed upon the idol caused him to disappear into the image. So there was only two options left. If you looked upon the idol, you could no longer exist as a being, you disappeared into the object. Vision rendered the seer, in this case Nandanar, invisible. Today there are many resplendent Chola bronze Natarajas in the National Museum. A 21st century Nandanar can walk into their presence without feeling that they're being rendered invisible. And for every time that there is a lot of talk about museums being stabilizing conservative forces, remember that the first museums were actually created by revolutionaries. The first proper public museum was created in the wake of the French Revolution, and conservatives were horrified at the fact that objects that had been sequestered away from the public gaze, only for the vision, only for the glance of the Pope or the King, could now be seen by common people. So museums stabilize, but they also destabilize the act of seeing. A Dalit man or woman can enter the museum, encounter the bronze Nataraja that they were forbidden to be in the presence of merely 100 years ago. Does the person who enters the museum as a Dalit exit it on the same terms? Something causes the act of seeing, the status of what is seen, and the identity of the person who does the seeing to be transformed by the many new and different ways in which vision itself is produced within the museum. The accumulation of these incrementally generated acts of seeing produce a new set of visible futures, or barely visible futures, or imagined futures. The person who enters the museum as a Dalit may exit it by changing what is seen in the museum. I am asking you to consider that it's not just the person who enters the museum that is changed. It is also the object in the museum that is changed by who comes in to see it. That alteration transforms the viewer as much as it reconfigures what is seen. Therefore, the history of objects in every museum is actually an open question. If you leave the museum a different person from the one who entered it, what happens to the person that you were when you entered? Do they get left behind? Does he or she get trapped like a ghost would in the museum machine, wandering the labyrinth like a threadless Theseus, chasing and being chased by a phantom Minotaur? It is not without reason that the words for the past and the words for ghosts in some of our languages are the same. Bhoot. Right? And one of the first Indian director of the Indian Museum, a man called Troilokanath Mukhopadhyay, was a master at the writing of ghost stories. So there is something about museums and ghosts that needs further investigation. But, so, every time I'm visiting the National Museum, even in its current dire state, I am drawn to a small 10.5 centimeter object, International Women's Day. This is the Naman has recently dedicated, I think he's been seeing Wonder Woman and Black Panther a little too much. He said this is a warrior. He has asked us to consider. The press has said that Naman has said that we might think this is a warrior. Rather than the dancing girl, as she was called. Nobody knows why she's dancing or what she's dancing. Anyway. So, this is object accession number HR 5721/195, found by the archaeologist D.R. Sahni in a broken down house in the 9th lane of the area designated as HR of the Indus Valley of Mohenjo-daro. Not far from the glass case where this object is kept lie the skeletal remains of a young woman from an Indus Valley site. The bones are arranged as if they've just been exposed during a day. Looking at the aslant jawbone of the exposed skeleton, I cannot help thinking to myself about the possibility that the miniature woman in bronze may be the actual portrait of an actual human being. It could have been this one, right? I know that somewhere in the National Museum in Karachi, Pakistan, there is another bronze figure numbered DK12728, found by Ernest Mackay in 1930-31, 5 years after the first one. In the late level 2 of Harappa in room 81, house X, block 9 of the area of Harappa designated as DKG. So DK12728 in Karachi is a twin of HR 5721/195 in Delhi, but she is somewhat unfairly nicknamed as the ugly sister. This has only to do with the sleazy eyes of museum curators who think that her butt is not as pronounced as that of HR 5721. Could these two tiny women in bronze, locked behind glass in two national museums, now separated by a militarized border, have been modeled after two actual human beings who lived, loved, fought, danced, breathed, and died like human beings always do? Could their mitochondrial DNA, inherited from Lucy, still be coursing through many women alive today, burning calories into energy in countless cells? Could there be a tantalizingly unbroken chain of causes and consequences that directly link the present realities experienced by human beings today to the distant past? Could our distant past, which was the actual present of two women in an Indus Valley city, who may or may not have been sisters, work its way into what would become the remote, scattered inheritance of 4,500 years old material culture? So, but in 2500 BC Harappa, who cast in bronze a servant girl? No one keeps records of soldiers and slaves. This is not me. This is the good man Agha Shahid Ali, who actually wrote a poem to HR 5721/195. The sculptor knew this, polishing the ache off her fingers stiff, from washing the walls and scrubbing the floors, from stirring the meat and the crushed asafoetida in the bitter gourd. But I am grateful, she smiled at the sculptor, as she smiles at me in bronze, the child who had to play woman to her lord when the warm June rains come to Harappa. Lots of assumptions there, just as, anyone makes assumptions. A poem turns Mohenjo-daro into Harappa, because it's not from Harappa, it's from Mohenjo-daro, as it easily might turn Delhi into Lahore, and the display of one museum into the storage of another. Ghosts are shapeshifters. Bones get mixed up when you dig for them. The museum is a crime scene, waiting for the patient detective and the poet of the future. A brief manifesto for the museum of the future. Whereas all museums are repositories of objects that are forgotten, either because they are too well known or not known at all. All of that needs to be remembered. The museum itself is hardly ever treated as an object in its own right. We need to wonder about what a museum is in order to think about what it yet may be. We need to stare at the showcase inset into the walls of our homes for a very long time to understand who we became as we arranged each souvenir. So, what will be the museum of the future? The museum of the future will be a philosophical playground. This is for January. The museum of the future will be a theatre for the rehearsal of unrealizable historical propositions. This is for Naman, because he said all the taxonomies will change, and they must. The museum of the future will be a theatre for the rehearsal of unrealizable historical propositions. The museum of the future will be a crime scene perpetually under investigation. The museum of the future will be a workshop for the repair of broken inquiries. The museum of the future will be a garage for the unlikely transport between ages. The museum of the future will be a warehouse for the storage of unresolved questions. Rahul Gore, you need to make room for the storage of unresolved questions. The museum of the future will be a terminus where the trains from tomorrow will arrive on time today. The museum of the future will be a spaceship for journeys into inner space and outer time. The museum of the future will be an agora where solitude will be exchanged for solidarity. The museum of the future will be a hospice where dated concepts will go to leave the world in peace, where we will finally get rid of the claim that the Indus Valley is a Vedic civilization. The museum of the future will be a clubhouse for retired civilizing missions. The museum of the future will be a studio for those who don't yet know that they are artists, like we were. The museum of the future will be a hothouse for the cultivation of rare life forms of the mind, wet lab. The museum of the future will be a hideout for fugitive good ideas. The museum of the future will be a penitentiary for cultural arrogances. And Mahesh Sharma will be a ticket man. The museum of the future will be a school for unlearning identitarian formulae. The museum of the future will be a library of misunderstood war text. The museum of the future will be an archive of forgotten proclamations about all that needs doing. The museum of the future will be a calendar of historical missed opportunities. The museum of the future will be a brothel for glamorous defeats and discounted victories. The museum of the future will be a switchboard for art forms, memories and histories to connect, disconnect and reconnect with each other and their extant or yet to be publics. The museum of the future will be more of a notional and less of a national museum.